Kinky, you're all that I've been thinking of. Kinky, take me inside and let the honey slide. I need you, kinky, good to me. Kinky, do all the things you should to me. Wake up and love the sleeping side of me. Open the gates and let the river free. Oh, Kinky, take me inside and let the honey slide. I need you, Kinky, love. Late at night in my bed as I lie here, somewhere in limbo land. Half awake, half asleep, halfway somewhere else. I know I should be sleeping, but how can I close my eyes when you know I understand you're a man and you've got to have your kinky love. I know I should be sleeping, but how can I close my eyes when you know I understand you, man, and you've got to have your kinky love. Kinky, I'm mad about you, kinky love. I need you so bad, I need you, kinky love. Kinky, you're all that I've been thinking of. Kinky, take me inside and let the honey slide. I need you, kinky love. Oh, Kinky, take me inside and let the honey slide. I need you, kinky love. Oh, Kinky, take me inside and let the honey slide. I need you, kinky love. Oh, Kinky, take me inside and let the honey slide. I need you, kinky love. Oh, Kinky, take me inside and let the honey slide.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Laura Henriksen. I'm the program director here at the Poetry Project, and I am so excited to be with you this evening for readings by Valerie Hsiung and Smailbegović. Before we get into the readings, I have just a few really quick reminders and updates. There are 2 all-gender restrooms located upstairs and 2 more here on the first floor through the sanctuary. If you need access to those first floor bathrooms, just find me or anyone on staff tonight and we can open the door for you. It's really beautiful to be with you this evening. I hope to see you at the Poetry Project again very soon. We have a lot of really, really special stuff coming up in the next few weeks. So on Wednesday in the sanctuary in our larger space, we will be hosting a celebration of Chris Martin, Adam Wolfond, and Aman Bukhela's new books. I'm really, really excited for this. Aman and Adam are two non-speaking artistic poets whose work will be read by a really wonderful chorus of poets, and then there'll be a conversation afterwards between Chris, who is their collaborator and teacher, and Adam and Aman with their communication partners. It's going to be a really, really special evening, and I hope very much that you'll join us for it. Then on Thursday, we're doing a special event with our collaborators and friends at Hauser and Wirth to celebrate the issue of the new publication that our editorial director, Kay Gabriel, put together. Ben Krusling will be reading in it, Lori Weeks, Ann Waldman. It's gonna be a really wonderful event, not here, but at Hauser and Wirth at their 22nd Street space. So I hope you will join us for that. And then it's a full week. We have one more reading. Then on Friday, Lucia Hinojosa Gaxiola and Guadalupe Maravilla will be performing here in the Parish Hall, and I know that they're planning something really, really special that involves a sound bath and other really exciting interventions in the space. So I would love to see you many, many times this week as we have many wonderful things coming up. Those are all of my announcements. It's now my real pleasure and honor to introduce Ada Smailbegović. In Calamities, Renee Gladman offers various examples of narrative and anti-narrative, encounters and dilemmas, eventually drawing the conclusion that despite the apparent division between these two states or qualities, it is in fact quite possible to be both narrative and anti-narrative simultaneously. I think about this a great deal while reading Ada Smailbegović's The Cloud Notebook, a book in which all detail is narrative, even as the pronomial figures that move through it are not held by a story. Smailbegović writes, the objects intercept what is narrative in the world's appearing, or maybe it is the other way around, the objects being like small suns out of which narrative can radiate, unquote. Origins here are ambiguous. Stories don't just begin and unfold. Narrative is both disrupted and intercepted, as it is also endlessly subdivided and multiplied by both possible and actual events, all the many reactions to and consequences of those events, the memories of witnesses, the forgotten detritus that remains. This is a searching, probing book, marking both rapid and violent transformations through war and displacement, as well as subtle incremental transformations, the slow decay of a lemon in a closed room over the summer. To watch something changing, to really see its bright edge, the events occurring inside it, is to notice detail appear in the crevices of green where no detail was visible before, unquote. Reading this book is like watching someone crack egg after egg into a bowl. In each egg, another picture of the world, and now we can see their shining, viscous contents, accumulating, radiant, and disturbing. Smailbegović reveals for us the invisible that trails and coats the visible, the dead surrounding the living, the homes left behind or destroyed, the inescapable loss, everything that could have been another way. She writes, there is a wish here for another realm, another dimension of the possible, and later, one can also think of everything that would have appeared if something had not disappeared. Being a book about narrative, about perception and absence, it is also a book about desiring through writing another form of time. I feel this impulse when I'm reading it to rip out the spine so that I can spread the pages all around me, so that I can somehow read each passage simultaneously, so that I can tumble through its roots, so I can hear every voice as one chorus, so we can follow its map of the clouds endlessly shifting. Please join me in welcoming Ada Smailbegović.
Thank you so much, Laura, for that really, really beautiful introduction and for having me read. Yeah, I feel like it is interesting how much this book is about micro-narrative and also about creating a poem that can contain anything. Like, in a sense, I wanted to create this, like, spacious universe in which any pattern could become a kind of micro-narrative. So it's a really perceptive and beautiful way of introducing it. Can everyone hear me? Is that okay? Okay. I guess the only other secret that I'm going to reveal is that there's a character, she, in the text, and she has a notebook, the Cloud notebook, and she writes in her notebook sometimes. So the majority of the text is this writing, and then in the middle of the book, you actually get the notebook. So in my reading, I'm going to read a few fragments from the long poem with the character she, and then I will actually read a little bit of a longer set of fragments from the notebook itself. The blue beetles crawl across the ground, tiny, numerous drops of sky, a blue bridge, fake teeth that a woman models out of bread and covers with white nail lacquer, a lattice through which the river is green or a thought is green, pressing into a wall. Later, she presses them into and over her real teeth, like little lacquered shells, and goes out into the evening, its sky. Later, she becomes a tree with round leaves in a blank landscape, the gulls resting their faces near each other. Everyone and no one looks at the tree. Someone leaves berries underneath it. Someone reaches for something inside the tree, although we can no longer see their hand once it disappears into its shell. She writes in her Cloud notebook, a numb hand or face breaks into sea foam. Constellations are 1,000 tiny pinpricks in the sky's sky. A gull flies over a shape of a gull in the sea, or a gull is only the yellow edge of a window. She returns to the point when all that is now yellowing had appeared at once, between days, the extended things, a surface near a surface, an explosive thing, a dark green and silver recess in this thing that she calls the forest. Everything appears between everything else that appears, she thinks. The orbits of time detach from the surfaces of the planets then. Sometimes she thinks she comes from a woman with the apples, who owned a horse, who knew the way from the train station to the house, or the green-eyed one, a carpet weaver, or the one who knew how to pull green beans from their hollows, and who escaped into the forest on a horse in war as a way of resisting the occupation, leaving her baby in a house with a blind room, or the one who escaped through the tunnel dug underneath the airport, or the one who spread her black coat on the ground next to the sea so that they can sleep, or the one who carried the rings and sold them. Sometimes she's not sure which one she is, or if the dream of the sea, the one with the golden elevator ascending the cliff with the red coral in the blue water, the one with the red, dense flesh of anemones in the dunes, is the same dream. A piece of wall may, under certain conditions, become indistinguishable from the side of a mountain, or a pink triangle made of wool may appear as a flush on someone's skin, the flight of pigeons from one brick building to another, or a whistle used to attract a horse. Even when holding a thin piece of metal in one's hand, one may ask, is it copper? Is it a bear? Is it a cup? A flat neon light fixture in an office building may be replaced by a flat photograph of a fish on ice. As she's walking home, she imagines that all of the objects that had been made to stand like towers and sticks were made instead as excavations in the ground, covered by starfish, sea anemones, and other forms of gem-like incrustations. Someone tells her they're studying ancient sunlight, or how all the liquid or solid dark matter that had been burned over the past 200 years had come from some sunlight, somewhere, touching something a long time ago. She reads a story in which chitons are impregnated by men and then they die. Not the chitons, but the men die or wander off, while the chitons swell and winter and eventually birth a form of uncontainable difference. Someone says, when the sun sets in the world, the sun also sets in the poem. Or is it the other way around, the poem having become wider and bigger than the world? Someone else says, a body is a paraphrase against a paper wall covered in violet flowers. A wall is a gesture the grass moves across with relative quiet. A yellow rock entirely covered with lichen shines even in the dark, as if on another planet. A dress hangs on a chair depicting a small landscape, 2 boys, a mountain, a bird in the tree between them. Or the mountain is a dune of pink seen through the fabric far away in the landscape, there and actual. Some salt is shaken onto the surface of the table. She does not remember whether the Beatles had come out onto the street late in the day or whether their appearance had occurred only at night. She wishes to belong to a species that did it all at once, in a cloud of occurrence. The smoothie fell apart, not into liquid, but into solid chunks of frozen strawberries, blobs of banana, and other fruit matter, a loose mixture floating in the background of a milky sea, now blue, now purple, as if a baby or another small animal had regurgitated its meal into her mouth. She felt that capitalism had failed her. The magic bullet had not made the objects of the world disappear into a homogeneous mass that could transition seamlessly into the interiority of her body. She considered the intransigence of the world, its refusal. What of the shapes that do not disappear, she thought, that are still floating in the sea or sky? The bridge was held up by the cement and blue steel. The wing was held up by muscle. The lines were held up by the asphalt between them. The voice was held up by ribbons of tissue. The mouth was held up by the teeth. A line of sight was held up by the telescope. A tarp moved the color blue above the bed of a truck in movement also. The small horses appeared to move their bodies over the pink cloth. But what appeared as their movement was only a form of disappearance, some of their bodies visible here and now, and some later with a delay. Okay, now I will read from the notebook itself. Emotions are the only way of having the world repeat itself. The lining of the world is supple, soft. A snail has secreted a thin sheath of slime around itself. This is written on a blue piece of paper. The sensation blue becomes the blueness of the sky. The sensation green becomes the greenness of the lawn, and so forth. We recognize the sky by the feature blue and the lawn by the feature green. Or the blue of the plums is the memory of the sea, or she's wrapped in cloth with roses on it. With roses on it? Or it is snowing and the men leave, or it is snowing and she cannot see. To preserve a fruit is to contain another time of sunlight in it, like playing charades with the faces of those who have disappeared, to see what one cannot see. Image of people waiting in line for bread or water. Image of people cutting trees in a city park for firewood. Image of people being evacuated on an airplane or a bus. An image by subtraction. The trees enter where the walls had been. Narrative reoccurs in each cut. Nacreous blue deposits of mussel shells, elaters with helical bands of blue and green flicking with changing moisture, unfold like a green lollipop full of slanting white lions behind a bush made sick in twilight. A mood is a body's precipice, like little crystals in a dish. Windowing an egg. In this tiny performance, rub the surface of the egg like a dusty moon with gauze soaked in ethanol, then place a piece of clear tape over an area of the egg and cut a window into the tape with a pair of scissors. A small window is cut into its shell and a piece of clear tape placed over it. Seeing the strange red moving dot, like a tiny insect from the rocks moving along your arm. One could close the world into an orb, shutting an appearance into things, like a flock of blue birds rising into the mountains, a dotted seal rising from the waters. They had cracked out of the egg, or had come into it, sucking the juice out of the long threads of the thistle, a bird with blue wings turned sideways, or a dress she's wearing made out of night. In the place where she wrapped birch bark around her wrists like an open costume, or the temporary monument of spreading flour under her window. She passes one piece of thread into her other hand, or they pass them in the car, not across the border, but to an adjacent point where they exit and walk. At the other side, another man picks them up. He had driven through the night, and they drive through the snow to the other side now. Or it was December 1995, and they were carried as one thread reaching an edge. A thread passing from one hand and into another. The edge of one's time is unknown. Tiny performance number 2. You enter a house of the architects with 12 mice who live in the cutlery drawers. It is the first spring that you remember clearly, and so it will always stay the spring. You walk through the garden upwards and then climb a small wall. You think that Bura, the wind, will blow you off in the opposite direction. It doesn't. Later you draw sailboats in complementary colors, orange and blue, yellow and purple, red and green. Memory is a small thing, like glow on the inside of an apartment building as you're peering in. Capitalism first appears as a proliferation of plastic objects in bright colors. You imagine the girl from London who sent you a crochet duckling in a humanitarian aid package. She imagines you. A story is a style you tell in the shape of a dream. This spring, in its remembered reoccurrence, like a laurel tree in the corner of the garden, always green, crinkled and waxy, its leaves, which you later do not recognize as what is placed, not placed, in a soup. Everything that can be carried out of a life in a bag or a suitcase. The first calico cat running out into the hallway and then never seeing it again, Not the hallway, not the red chairs, not the green edges of the windows, not the drawer with the comic books that begins to fill with the ocean. Not the mouse that you may have or may have not stolen from the mouse city, sitting in a basket on a merry-go-round, nor the mouse you find later, blind on the street, and make a nest for on the grass out of a pair of underwear. Tiny performance number 3. How to ask a question in such a way that it gives someone as many chances to be interesting as possible. She takes each of her 22 sheep a bowl with its breakfast. But there are not 22, but 23 bowls. That is always one too many. Or you're folding pieces of paper into 3-dimensional shapes. There are pyramids and cones, cubes and solids of all shapes, irregular and regular geometries. Sometimes the paper is white or yellow. Sometimes it is tinted pink or touched with gold. In front of you is a small table, the shape of a small, flat sea. Each shape is wrong in some way. You set them out on the table one by one as they're made. Inside of the inaccuracies of each, something appears, a shimmer or a tint, not a pattern or form, but movement on the way to somewhere. Now the landscape changes. The pink enters it. The seagulls come to rest on the red roof. Time slows down inside the incrustations of objects. Time is a material. The dancers move in a white room, in and through the blue light. She hears laughter in the trees. In April 1994, a book of recipes was published in Zagreb. The recipes were based on using the ingredients that were distributed as humanitarian aid in Sarajevo under siege. The printing of the book was supported by the World Health Organization, UNHCR, and the UN World Food Program. The author of the cookbook, Enesa Sheremet, herself, survived 20 months of the siege of Sarajevo, 20 months that she calls in the preface to the book, an imitation of life. No bake chocolate war cake. Half a cup of cooking oil, half a cup of milk powder, half a cup of sugar, half a cup of cocoa powder, 1 3/4 cups water, 8 slices of sandwich bread torn into bite-sized pieces. Place cooking oil, milk powder, sugar, and cocoa powder in a large saucepan and stir to combine. Add water and place mixture over medium heat, stirring constantly until blended. Gradually add bread pieces until mixture forms single piece. Spread mixture in the oval dish and let cool. Spread war cake icing on cooled cake and serve. War cake icing. 4 tablespoons milk powder, 3 tablespoons flour, 3 tablespoons sugar, 1 tablespoon cocoa powder, 1 cup water. Place milk powder, flour, sugar, cocoa powder, and water in saucepan. Cook over medium heat until ingredients form frosting-like consistency. Let cool before spreading on cake. What is tied up or clipped in loops like a sail of an invisible boat of pink satin, which shimmers, bruised like a cherry, fallen between a chest and a tree? The embroidery of the butterfly on the canatieritsa, or the oily dark fish with faint blue stripes pulled out of the sea's surface. Each pass a description like a drawing attaching at the golden loops and dots, the flickers of thought, as if exhaustive and separate at once, noticing the marks of the sea on the fish as another kind of bruising, where the flowers left on the glaze of the biscuit are nearly inedible, some like twisted gold ribbon or gold leaf, a kind of rose we cannot touch. The clouds are a flicker of a moon tent, a kind of memorial that can be sent up as figures carved out of the snow and given names and left to melt. Carried from the car, you could only be a small body, the time folding inside of you like a bone. The cat has multiplied in your dreams, become more than one identical cat you have forgotten somewhere. It's a reoccurring nightmare. I won't say more. How the birds still fly where the trees had stood in their sparseness. Now the figure seems clothed and not simply stone, as if they had dressed her. Someone has blinded the house, has hung paintings in the shell of ghosts. She enters her van to smell an apple and unfold a paper glass within which a piece of chewed gum is folded inwards as if held in cellophane like a smile. These are the residues of a world, each an unfolding, as in the space of a stem, the impossibly small can be hidden even before it enters. A blue half-planet on a piece of paper. She has a pink swimming pool. A blue balloon turns into two birds, pink and heart-shaped. The candy that was in my mouth, carrying the flowers with the long stems. An orange cloth behind them. A round chalk shape with three rectangular lines falling out of and into a world, falling into a world. These iterative versions of a self, looking at myself across the water. Tiny performance number 6. Place a suitcase shut and flat on a chair. Use as a desk. Only one animal, a female black bear, remains alive of the 100 there were when the siege began in April. She's mangy, perhaps half her weight when the ordeal started, and she barely has the strength to stand upright against the rusting bars of her cage when visitors arrive with a loaf of bread and a few snatches of grass. After surviving a siege for more than 200 days, a bear, the last surviving animal in the zoo in Sarajevo, has died. We took her some bread and an apple last week, but she was too weak to eat them, Pal Takac, a zoo employee, said Tuesday. Tiny performance number 7. In this tiny performance, you're the girl in the snow. Like a sheet in time, you cannot see yourself. A figure placed in the distance looks outward. Pythia would then remove her purple veil. She would wear a short, plain white dress. The rising smoke was a signal that the oracle was open. Await not in quiet the coming of the horses, the marching feet, the armed host upon the land. Slip away, turn your back. You will meet in battle anyway. You will go, you will return never. In war will you perish. You will go, you will return. Never in war will you perish. You will go, you will return. Never in war will you perish. The gold nuggets fell out of the cavities and landed in the dirt. The dirt was continuous, like one long sheet. Sometimes it found forms of difference or separation in the long stomachs of worms. Anything contains an outside inside of it. A donut is a simple shape with a hole. They had entered the interior of the office building, moving through the dim corridor towards the red light. The worms were in love with the nuggets of gold, and so they forgot about the continuities of the dirt and the inner cavities of their bodies. The worms said, lick, lick, click, click, and the gold said, click, click, lick, click. All interior space is the outside folded in, a series of invaginations that tunnel through a ball to create spaces where things can be kept separate. Small tissues, some of thin pink fabric floating in the wind. The ants had come for the honey, and then one night they had changed their route. Having become pregnant, but following her fascination with a sighting of a rabbit, of a creature resembling a rabbit, but whose heart and lungs grew without, outside its body. about 14 days since she was delivered by the same person of a perfect rabbit. The woman had made oath that 2 months ago, being working in a field with other women, they put up a rabbit who, running from them, they pursued it. From that time, she have not been able to avoid thinking of rabbits. Those were formed in her imagination from a rabbit she was fond of that slept on the bed at night. As such, early impressions as from a dream or plain sight of household pets can imprint themselves on what appears and should be avoided. Others say that if it be a fact, a veil should be drawn over it. A sound of hair being cut, the dream is of cloth or what she sees, oranges and blue flowers on cloth. The world is cut through. We cannot see its inside. The blue of the plums is the memory of the sea. How is the material of the present, the dust on the plums, a memory of another world before? The blue of Adriatic turning into the green of Pacific. The storm finds them out of nothing, carries them in the blue cave. She throws fabric over water for them to walk on. We don't see anything in the snow, stretched with blue silk like the ocean between the fingers, a naming of the islands in the Adriatic Sea. Korčula, Mljet, Hvar, Paj, Krk, Cres, Lastovo. We count them all, and I tell you about uncountable experience. The water dripping between the fingers, such glancing things, as if the body deflected them in noticing the winter light. You shake the cat to awaken it from deep sleep, to reassure yourself away from death. Reading its gums, the small sedimentation of glistening white teeth, so unlike yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ada. That was so beautiful. I'm just so deeply excited about this book, and we have a couple of copies still available for sale. For if you haven't spent time with it yet already, I really encourage you to do so. It is now my incredible honor and pleasure to welcome Andrea Abikaram to the stage to introduce Valerie Hsiung.
Good evening, everyone. Tonight, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Valerie Hsiung. Valerie's work begins with an invitation for the reader to join the poet in the act of bookmaking, in enlivening the text from the page to swallow and scream, project and drown and grasp. Simultaneously, Valerie acknowledges and embraces her role as author, and we, the audience, the reader, are lucky in that she bravely brings her whole self to the fore. Her latest accomplishment, The Only Name We Can Call It Now Is Not Its Only Name, opens with the journeys of how language is learned, charted across generations and continents, urban parking lots, and a farm at once both violent and divine. At times playful, at times haunted, Valerie's quick cuts across time, space, subjectivity, and narrative forcefully immerse the reader in her polyvocal, polygeographic, prosodic lyric universe. Overlapping storylines and subjectivities aggregate and necessarily dislocate, and in an attempt to match the generosity of her poet's spirit to give us her whole self in the work, I trust her to take me anywhere and let go any lingering expectations of where we, as in poet and reader together, are headed. In this charge for the reader to give in to immersion, she challenges us directly, quote, "It takes a lot of guts to go steadfastly into the wind, no matter what direction it's blowing," which I interpret as her response to sensing the friction between the final finger and the concrete or barn overhang before we let go or slip off, whichever happens first. Lenses into the poet's craft and also the discipline of poetic practice are studied throughout Valerie's work. Quote, what is the proxy and what is the practice? What separates practice from projectile? Bringing in the methodology, the decentralized mythology of writing into the writing itself transforms the book into organism, responding to the exhales and questions of writers and readers alike searching for ways to be a writer in our hellish techno-capital present, to which she answers, quote, so as a decentralizing practice, I've been writing naked, in a new place, half naked or fully each day. Valerie concurrently propels us between time, place, relation, and rapidly kaleidoscopes us between the micro-visceral and the macro-infrastructural in the short space of the line. Quote, someone, the governor, mayor, councilman, etc., was chewing up my stash, my collarbones. Cranking the heat up, playfulness becomes mischievousness, becomes vengeance. Here, I'm reminded of Sylvia Plath, quote, I don't have a car, Kay, otherwise I would help you. And I have ornamental calves, Kay, otherwise I would help you. I levitate with my arms so I can break men, 1,000 humans. While I'd been a reader and fan of Valerie's work for quite some time, I only recently had the chance to meet her in Seattle at this year's AWP a couple months ago. By the time I got to the Counterpath table, her newest book, The Only Name We Can Call It Now Is Not Its Only Name, was very much sold out, though I was able to snag a copy of To Love an Artist. And as fellow Leos, we took a selfie together. So I urge you to hit the book table as soon as the readings conclude before they sell out. You're in for a wild ride. Valerie Hsiung is a poet, interdisciplinary artist, and the author of multiple poetry and hybrid writing collections, including The Nath, which is forthcoming next year. The Only Name We Can Call It Now Is Not Its Only Name, To Love an Artist, Outside Voices, Please, Name, Date of Birth, Emergency Contact, You and Me Forever, and EFG. Her writing has appeared in print, in flesh, in sound waves, and other forms of particulate matter. Her work has been supported by the Foundation for Contemporary Arts, PEN America, Lighthouse Works, and public streets and trails she has walked on and hummed along for years. Born in the year of the earth snake and raised by Chinese-Taiwanese immigrants in Cincinnati, Ohio, she now lives in the mountains of Colorado, where she teaches as assistant professor of creative writing and poetics at Naropa's Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics. Please join me in welcoming Valerie Hsiung to the stage.
She remembers two parts to the beginning of her life, sitting on the stairs on a threshold between calling out for company, calling out for an orange, and staying silent and still and strong, a strongness she couldn't name, a strongness that would have to reveal itself to her in other, windier ways, perhaps one day as the same staircase, triumphant in its decrepitude. Did everyone else have trouble falling asleep in those days, crawling up and down? It is possible to think without looking back, in those two-faced beginnings, when richness belonged to a future that did not exist. For if it did exist, the present would not have been so terrifying. The presence of a house of sleeping bodies would not hold so much space. In fact, if we dwell on, for example, a basket of fruit or mold growing in the bathroom or something else sweet yet caustic, time does not proceed. We have erased essentially time. On the contrary, when we fall into time, when we give in to it, which might sound innocent, but in a moment like this can function as an obliteration of dualities, we hold on to nothing, even if in the very act we know there is something to hold on to, even if we know there is something we won't ever let go of. Because, and so, it is possible to never let go of something we in fact never even once did hold. She thinks she had philosophies dug inside her since before she knew what she was doing with her settlement, that when she spoke about small transportation vehicles which floated and were guided by wind, that she was actually speaking about blindness. In the time between her first life and her second life, she founded 2 gates in her right hand. She thinks she started her life as a lie. She would imagine there was a room that emanated heat, and she would point to the closet and say, "There is a room inside that room." Because these people do not listen, they do not listen. And she forgets the empathy which grew inside her like a marvelous toad, because she has extended something called empathy inside her so far as to open her legs wide, 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 that she must recoil, she must dot herself, she must dot her diminishing self, she must stroke, she must even dote, but she cannot do this while she is awake, because we must step away from approaching her. Today is not a day. To say today is only to help ourselves, to make ourselves feel less helpless in being unable to help her. She doesn't want. That would disgust us all. It would instigate the sheer disgust that lives within the both of us. She is stepping away from approaching herself, but in order to do so, she must come a bit closer. We must turn against the wall. So she comes closer to herself, and then she recoils. In fact, in sleeping so, on her stomach, her left knee bent and brought to the side, higher in line with her hip, she recoils from the approach she makes towards someone in her sleep, because there was someone pointing a finger at her, and she was always reassured by the others who watched her tossing and turning. There's no one there, because there was someone saying something which she had to move a lot of the overgrown bush aside in order to hear. She had to comb her thick lefty to the side in order to hear, and she was good then at pushing the grocery cart further along to catch up, to meet at the end. We will leave on Saturday to go see the people you love. It was an accident which ended up attuning us to the correct strategy which would get her to trust more of us. But before they could leave for Saturday, she approached her mother while her mother was lying in bed, her body falling down to the sides. "I have to show you something. I promise. You promise what? I promise I don't know how it happened. I have to show you something. I'm worried, Mother." And for her mother, she opened up her legs. She knew even then, in the first half of her life, that the timeless part of the house was missing: the bell and the rotting wood, the pan to pick up water, the rats coming in from inside and from out the bell, and the crushed bits of Job's tears brought in between the toes. But she did not know it was the bell, the rotting wood, the pan to pick up water, the rats coming in from inside and out, the bell, the crushed bits of Job's tears. She wasn't supposed to tell herself, but she didn't turn to the people who had brought her into this world to tell herself. Instead of being timeless, this was a house that had no time. Though she knew a beautiful widow had once lived in the home, and whose insanity had been the reason they came into possession of the home, the widow had been hurt by the bravery of certain people in her life, wanting to show the house to the world, taking the forest which covered it like long hair over a greasy and embarrassed face, making it a part of a world that it may have been better left unbelonging. This was why, when she sat on the steps covered in a woven fabric, she had to be the passageway for the house to face the house, for the house wanting to show itself to itself, although in the beginning of the first life, she didn't always feel split in two. She just felt that the ground had pushed something through her and got stuck at the hinge of her mouth, so that for many years she had to hold it inside of her rather than having an open airway, the way many people did. Whether she was lean and boyish or rounder and boyish, her mother would remark, look at her body, without parade or glove. She said this enough that she began to look at herself, and she began to see when others looked at her. She didn't know this was each time the house trying to look at itself. Later, in the second half of her life, when people she had no relation with would seem to act like she had come from them somehow, or that they together yet separately had come from the same thing, she would stand between two sharp things, unsure what was the best way to move around, wondering how she had come through a maze of many sharp things, protruding out at all different kinds of angles, how even a neglected corner could contain the sharpest kind of angle. Like there was no warning strong enough. Later, in the second half of her life, when she would be putting a hand to the first life, and she would hold the mat still like it was a rock on top of her head or a bucket of water, and she would watch various passengers who came and went at the crossway seek to perform surgery without cutting a knife, and she would not laugh at them, though there was laughter, like carolers all around them, like rotting wood, or something itchy she knew that lived under the brown leaves under her skin. Outside the house, there was a finite amount of windows. Whether she slept in her bed upstairs, or whether she slept on the sofa downstairs, whether she slept on the bed in the basement, there were windows. Inside the house, this changed. Why are you eating that porridge? I have to eat this porridge before it goes bad, and because it's the only thing that settles the stomach. And then she would lead her friend who one day into a game vanished unwarranted on. In this way, she did listen. During the first part of her life, her burden was spending time making her body radial, when you cannot aspire to make any body radial, or some can but shouldn't, or some can but she couldn't. What she was really good at was falling down, but it wouldn't be until the beginning of the second part of her life, or the ending of the first, that she would have a place or even a chance to fall and to demonstrate gravity for those who had also mostly only been exposed to striving radial bodies. There are conditions we live under that feel like we are being swatted at, she was told, or that make it seem like the air is warning us to move. It's not the wind, it's an external force coming toward us, and the air is our friend. Now look up. And she looked up as a plane was passing by, and she understood the phenomenon of being a passenger on the plane, a plane flying above her, simultaneously as she was not a passenger, but just a person on the ground over which the plane with the passenger version of herself was passing over. She felt the dark blueness of the inside of the plane inside her, and she felt the dark blackness of the ocean inside her outside of the plane, and she saw where she was. Then she felt 1,000 beetles squirm underneath her bottom. She looked back at the house. It was only a few feet away. Was she listening? Or had she learned to pretend to make it through another day by means of food? The gnats keep dying, the gnats keep getting bigger, and between her hands they are rolled apart into dust. Having held her up her persecution like a table held by a mother against a chair, slamming down with the force of a bullied boy who has been denied psychiatric care, we can see two faces clutching onto each other through something like a harvest. Why? When all the townsfolk are celebrating the harvest, dancing, showing skin the one day of the year when we will be too tired the next day to cast aspersions on those who showed skin, too tired or forgetful with mule wine, our two faces clutching each other so close. She did not live in the garden. She did not live near a garden. There was a garden out front that was tended one year, but then in her second life, she would not remember how long the garden lasted, if she dreamt it, if 10-legged bugs really fell into her mother's hair one afternoon gardening, though this last event became a smudged reality, the only real garden fact. Her mother's certainty of things that fell onto us, her mother's certainty of things that crawl over us drove her in her second life to a bowl of daily porridge. Look what we have. See? I got it. See? There were things she saw in the first half of her life that she should have never repeated to anyone, but she would. And this would cause 1,000 rocks to be thrown against her. Things like humans plucking the feathers off of waterfowl, like ducks, and then roasting them in the open. Things like a firecracker burning through her sister's jacket, but not leaving a single mark on hand, neck, or face. Things like that. It was hard for her then to get a match between the truth that the world told and the truth she herself told as she knew it. From this, she began to distrust anyone who held a ruler. And if not distrust, then she would preemptively laugh at them before they could accuse her. She would enter a room of people who held rulers, who were studying the game very precisely, expecting them to accuse her of something. On her way in, she was already laughing. She did not notice many things that would have been good for her acclimation to such hostile environments, but she did notice some things that life would not directly reward her for, things it would later on reward her for, in ways that sometimes to other people seemed rather like a punishment, yet to her seemed like something she had only worked for. One of these things was the way people would hide their knowledge from others. They would hide knowing where someone was, perhaps because they had promised that they wouldn't tell anyone no matter who asked where the someone was. Sometimes, even without anyone asking them to hide what they knew about where someone was, some people would still hide what they knew. This was one thing that she noticed. When a child is faced with learning the correct way to do something, for example, how to say a word, and there are competing forces in her life, one which is saying it the correct way, and the other which is striving to say it the correct way, but repeatedly is saying it incorrectly, will the child round herself out in the middle of these right and striving yet wrong ways of saying something, or will the world quickly show the child who is right and who is wrong, and the child will come to judge, laugh, and feel embarrassed for the ones saying it all wrong? Why do some people sleep under a net with a burning coil and others bring snow inside for water? Though this was not a question that she brought into a room with a heavy door during any official visit of sorts, the person in the robe who was determined to find whether she was there to stay indefinitely or there merely to refuel, to get clean, and then to move on to some other hospitality, found themselves asking this question as though it were a mere echo of a question that had really first formed inside of the one being probed, and the person in the robe was merely only now coming into contact with it. It was no evidence of any divinity or capacity for clairvoyance of the person in the robe, but rather it made him shudder because it was the first sign that perhaps he was not the one of the original cast, but rather a vessel made to interpret then. He would never repeat this to anyone else, but that day forward, he would begin to hear her voice instead of his own any time he said something out loud. Perhaps because she never believed there was nothing to flee from, never believed that it was something she had inherited to stay in one place for longer than a week or two before needing to move further and further in whichever direction was oppositional to the force of entry. Friends of her mother would knock on the door and then disappear. She would open the door and there would be a cold pot of radish soup with a thin layer of fat at the top. Was she now living her second life already? In the first half of her life, she didn't know the reason for her stomach troubles or why they slowly went away, as she was forgetting the reason one has a first life to begin with at all. She stopped putting her hand in her mouth. She started treating her hands as though they had to be in a condition fair enough to touch the sick. That was how she had begun to see herself. The energy of the world has to bypass a medium, and the energy of the world wants a body with which to tire itself out on. If the energy of the world is kept within an unused body, it will be like an uncovered car in a hailstorm. Then you go out in the late morning after the message has been conveyed to collect all of the eggs. Instead of climbing up the mountain, people are climbing up the new contraption in the same place where the daddy longlegs prefer to lay their eggs. The energy of the world, that's where the energy of the world gets its name from. What were her hands made for darning? What was her back made for raising? No one taught her how to walk. She can't remember doing that. She can remember the water boiling, bringing it up stiff. She can remember cutting the paper in half, making index cards, making flashcards, almost cutting her arm in half. But she can't remember who brought the wood and who brought the axe. Something warm-blooded and upright and disguised inside her wanted her legs to move, but she didn't have a path and she didn't know. Only later, deep in her second life, would she come across after traveling many miles on a path of view, and while traveling on this path would think of what her legs were made for, and would think of the 28 miles something warm-blooded and upright and disguised inside her had tread day after day for many years. That something warm-blooded and upright and disguised inside her didn't long for things. It just saw what it didn't have, what it could have had, and then covered itself with a dish rag around the neck and tried to sleep. One day, her eyes might also deteriorate from 2 cataracts becoming 1 cataract, moving closer to something so warm-blooded, a kind of movement that is possible only if you have never heard your own laugh, a laugh that something so warm-blooded will never forget. These eyes will become so degenerate. The first floor house will be taken over by all kinds of things, and some of what takes it over will crawl into the suitcase of the degenerate, and she will take this with her to the next place she goes. She never thought that this could be how a message gets passed on. Once, near the end of the beginning of her second life, she realized she was not alone. She realized that that gap, which was too much to bridge between her past life and the life she was set to live now, was not just something she felt like a woodpecker on her femur, but was something that she had also occurred to other people who were going station to station. And yet even this realization of an occurrence outside of her did not make her think there was enough time for all the workers to build the bridge in time for the people going to station in her past life to cross, for her to cross either. When she was living her first life, when asked a question, sometimes she would also respond in a way that was based more on what she thought the questioner wanted to hear. This did not make her more corrupt. When she was living her first life, she wasn't big enough to carry the people leading her from station to station. And she thought when she was big enough, she would carry those people then. Why did she learn things so quickly? What had happened to her very early on that took away a theory of incremental learning? Who saw her small body as a problem to teach something so quickly? Wanting to be better about holding a cup midair, she thinks that whatever is inflicted upon a child must come out in an exit wound. Her mother had referred to her birth as a miracle. She never claimed to be untouched, but she was only once touched, and in that one touching was she conceived. The people who induce claustrophobia in grocery stores have one childhood photo. They're wearing a cowboy costume. By the time her injuries had healed for the crime of wandering, she had other injuries waiting for her. Everyone stands there. Even the kids who had been chasing around a ball stands now, halted, as the tent is erected over the house that is the church's new meeting spot. Everyone stands there. The people who had their arms hanging to the sides now take them and place them in their pockets. The people with hands in their pockets now take them out and cross their chest. The kid who was the first kid to blow the whistle, not in her first life, for that would be 0. That would be the reset between negative and positive. But the first kid that she blew the whistle to scratches her head and tugs on someone's arm like on a scarecrow. It's not that everyone has suddenly come out of their oblivion, but that they had to pick a day without wind to begin the process. They had, in fact, finally come out to meet their oblivion. They live there, and I live here, and you live there, and we live here. Towards the middle of her first life, she rode her bike past the house as it was beginning the process, pedaling against the wind with a weight as though she were carrying her friend on the handlebars, even though there were no handlebars and there was no wind or friend. The process was beginning. When the apple dropped from the tree, it hit her head and she looked up and caught the next one in her mouth. There was a slanting in the way the days would now get longer and longer. There was a slanting that we could not see. The longer the people stay outside in the day, through and into midday, the more layers they will remove. She wanted to put another layer back on. If she walked back inside to use the restroom, she would leave things she had come to depend on outside. She would stop keeping watch of the men, and at any minute they could fall. What accent did they have, these men whose mouths were filled with easy condemnations? When a family's cow grew sick and they were told nothing would make her better anymore, they turned. Because they were told there was nothing beyond, they turned. And then when the cow became repaired, of course they turned even more. When a family's child went for a walk and never returned, and they were told that every door had been knocked on, every hut had been searched, every man with a wry smile had been requisitioned, they turned. And when the child did return, again they turned further. There was always someone in the town who was not welcome at first, until too many cows grew sick, until too many childs did not return, until too many men were struck with boils, and then they turned to that someone. They sought out that someone who was wondering if they would have to leave overnight, turning from the least welcome person in the town to the most powerful. Her whole life felt like one long turn, but she wasn't sure if what one turned towards should really be given an image. We may cut a house in half to see what's inside, but we may learn that generation by generation, they are not the same markers between. Early on, there was a mother and a child who could neither be said to be boy nor girl who came to stay for a while. It was never identified what offense against the child was laid, but as these things go, the fault was laid against the mother, who was a person no one, not even she, who spent the most time out of anyone inside the house, who gave them fresh bedding, who brought them trays of porridge, could give a visual format for. In one of the busiest years of the house, another broken family, 2 girls, stayed in another room. She was sent with a wagon to greet them and sell them anything they might need in addition. Is there a place nearby we can get some supper? A few miles up the road, but the kitchen will be closed. A few days later, she saw the 2 girls teaching wonton signs, which diligently the boy emulated and embodied. The girls, who were one of the few who didn't take trays of porridge up in the room, would run down the stairs inventing songs of war, and on their way down they would call, "Joey, Joey," who, like a kangaroo, hopped down after them. Under the table, she caught them stroking Joey's knee and then laughing. She could tell that the younger of the sisters was the more messed up one, and it was the one who was the more messed up one that she also felt would end up saving a lot of nobodies. If she survived in the long haul, something would happen. When she saw how his body had become a template, the boy's mother's facelessness was sealed. Why did some people announce to others their hungriness as though it weren't a plea, as though they weren't holding their hand out, even if they weren't standing on the median of a road? It didn't mean they weren't holding their hand out. Had she done this before as well? Not to anyone who could be claimed to have found her as much as she found them. Has she ever wandered into the kitchen while her mother sat on the sofa and said, "I'm hungry," as though she were just remarking on the cloudy weather? Surely she had wandered into the kitchen while her mother sat on the sofa and said, "I'm hungry." But then she was upfront about what she was looking for in her mother. She wanted her mother to get up off the sofa and lead her out of the house. She never even thought once it was an option for her to change the weather, although that's probably what she was pointing to. Whereas later, when someone else would wander into the kitchen while she herself sat on the sofa, and she heard this someone say, "I'm hungry," and she knew she was meant to hear this, and that she couldn't pretend she didn't. She bore down on not pointing. Even if your mother never taught you a thing about hunger, sooner or later, you'd have to find out yourself. But a new loaf of bread, uneaten, will eventually grow stale, Every new loaf of bread uneaten will first grow stale. Later, in her second life, when it would come to her to turn to make something for the other passengers, she always had to start with her mother going home and going with her mother going home. In the very beginning of her first life, how she would sleep on the ground, how she couldn't breathe, how she stopped being able to hear. And then the next day they were on a street and seeing, while the rest of the world had ears covering their eyes, an old man ogling at her mother. She stepped between them as though her growing body could make the space between them further. But the old man merely took his cane and with it ogled her. Then a tooth wiggled out from up her. And then the next moment her mother was pointing to some fruit, and the fruit seller's mouth was dark and moved, as though she were already under the sun eating them. Her mother asked almost sweetly, "Sweet are they?" And bending over the ground as though this fruit had grown from her own bed, her dark and moving mouth jumped on the mother's words. "Oh, sweet as could ever be, sweeter than the hands that made them, sweeter than how sweet." And she felt that the old man who had ogled her had become this fruit seller before them now. And as the mother, with too many teeth in her mouth to count, convinced enough by stuttering sweetness, waved the seller on, giving coins without counting, as though really they were exchanging something in their mouths, and the coins were just for showing, she thought what kind of sweetness there was to make someone make themselves laugh like that, full well knowing there was for her later a talking to in store. While she was dangling her legs in the waiting room, someone had laughed inside her mother's mouth. Though she is certain that the fruit seller closed the triangle between her and her mother, she is also certain that the way she heard the words of the fruit seller would somehow pass through the mouth of her mother, so that a closing always had to leave a little room at the edge for entering. Don't you see how we made this happen? Don't you see how we brought hurt to us? Other times when her mother hadn't been home for weeks and she wandered into the kitchen hoping she didn't even need to say anything, the two sisters would laugh knowingly, and laughing in the room while she was there was the only way that one could look through the window and assert that she had in any way actually lived in this house. Then they would go to the backyard, and one of them would beat the other one in several rounds of tetherball before they swung their legs around to the front yard, pushing each other sideways, getting each other's hairs in each other's mouths, and laid out on the grass in their swimsuits, which had been underneath their t-shirts and shorts all day, as though they didn't own any proper underwear. "They're laying in our spot," she would say while looking out at them through the window. "They're laying there." And the sisters would lay there until they sweated the sweetness that originated outside of them but had to pass through them, right through themselves. Can such a bargain really be said to be carried out equally? Can such a bondage ever really be paid off? If the fruit seller had more than half a tongue, she would have licked her wrinkled lips. If the fruit seller had more than half her teeth, she would be chittering. Like goes to like is the answer. When the mother found herself before the fruit seller, something inside them recognized each other, even as the living eyes of mother and fruit seller were blind to this immediate encounter, both of them only tasting the fruit at the end of the answer. Indeed, that afternoon, before she could do anything else, before she could only hope to sit there and do nothing and count the coins remaining, when they got back to the home that was only going, before even rinsing, she threw one of the red fruits into her darkening mouth, as only one who grew up throwing seeds into her mouth and whittling the afternoon away on the hot street could do. "Is it sweet?" "Sweeter than how sweet." And she found that the way her mother said it seemed as though it had first been her. It had first been her in the first place who had whispered these words, these first words, into the deaf ear of the fruit seller. Then she took a plate of the fruit the way a child with a crooked smile near the equator takes a plate of fruit in a hospital. Someone put her up to it. She wanted a stomach as strong as her mother's, and she wanted a home as strong as her mother's, which would one day before long be demolished. But she could be still, landlocked, for 48 hours straight, and still she'd appear to all towering around her, as though she just climbed up a hill, so out of breath was she. Boil up some water. And by the time the water in the next room was brought to a boil, they had long forgotten about it. So when they heard that kettle shaking, they made the mistake of thinking it was an unlocking, that they'd instinctively extend their hands into the air at the sides, forming the shape of golden scales, as though they could account for the closeness of this mistaken unlocking. Not everyone did this. Some guarded their heads immediately. Some took pictures into themselves and then guarded their heads afterwards. From where she laid, she didn't see signs in the pictures that everything was all right. From the pictures on shelves and walls, instead, she only saw signs of what wasn't all right. A vow that is never tested might not be considered a vow at all. When she was more on the verge of falling into the unlocking than she ever would be later, she wasted the day away. That's how later she never had to look down to double check that her shoelaces were fully knotted. Thank you. And thank you so much to Andrea for an amazing introduction.
Wow, thank you so much. This was truly such an astonishing reading. I really, thank you so much, Andrea. That intro was just perfect. Thank you so much, Valerie. Thank you so much, Ada. Thank you all for being here. We do still have copies of these books, which, as you now know very well, you need in your life as soon as possible, which could be as soon as right now. So thank you again. See you at the project very soon, I hope, like in this week maybe. All right, good night. Thank you.